Howdy. Howdy. I just love it. I love it. I love it. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and I have the honor of serving as the acting dean here at the Bush School of Government. I'd like to also welcome you to the 2023 ConocoPhillips White House Lecture Series. A very special thank you goes out to ConocoPhillips for being the sponsor of this event. And I'd like to recognize a few guests that we have here in the audience tonight. The Bush School Advisory Council has been meeting all day today, and I pretty much wore them out. But could I have the members of the Bush School Advisory Council just please stand up and be recognized? I really want to thank all of you for the work that you do for the Bush School. We have the President and CEO of Texas A&M Association of Former Students, Porter Gardner. President and CEO of Texas A&M Corps Cadets Association, Bruce Hamilton. The CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, Max Angerholzer. And the acting director of the George H.W. Bush Library and Museum, Robert Holzweiss, and his wife, Peggy. We have another special person in the audience today, the recipient of the 2023 Bush School's Political Science Outstanding Alumni Award. This will be the first time that we've given this award for a political science graduate. And that's John D. White. John, are you here? And last but not least, so I don't get in trouble, my wife, Janice. Thank you for being here. And I'd like to invite Dr. Raymond Robertson to the stage. Raymond's the holder of the Helen and Roy Rue Chair in Economics and Government at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. He's also the director of the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy. Raymond.
Thank you very much, Frank, for welcoming us tonight. It's such a pleasure to see you all here. This is such a wonderful turnout, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to be back now that we've fully recovered from COVID, and it's so great to see you all again. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I have the honor tonight of introducing our very distinguished speaker, the Honorable Henry Cisneros, who will be speaking to us tonight about the importance and role of modernized infrastructure in the nation's economic and national security future. Henry Cisneros is Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors and equity owner of Shank Williams Cisneros & Company and Principal of Siebert Williams Shank & Company, a national municipal and corporate finance firm. He founded CityView in 2003 and continues to actively invest in projects. CityView is a partner in building more than 100 communities in 13 states, including more than 7,000 homes with a total value of over $5 billion. Cisneros' community building career began at the local level. After serving 3 terms as a city council member, in 1981, Cisneros became the first Hispanic American mayor of a major U.S. city, San Antonio, Texas. During his 4 terms, he helped rebuild the city's economic base and spurred the creation of jobs through massive infrastructure and downtown improvements. Anyone who's been to San Antonio knows these very well because they carry the city to this day. In 1992, President Clinton appointed Cisneros to be Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Secretary Cisneros has been credited with initiating the revitalization of many of the nation's public housing projects and developments, with formulating policies that contributed to achieving the nation's highest ever home ownership rate. In his role as the President's chief representative to the nation's cities, Cisneros personally worked in more than 200 U.S. cities in every one of the 50 U.S. states. After leaving HUD in 1997, Cisneros served as president and chief operating officer, and then on the board of directors of Univision Communications until 2020. Cisneros also served as president of the National League of Cities, as deputy chair of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and as a vice chairman of Habitat for Humanity International. He has authored or edited several books, including Opportunities in Progress, a bipartisan platform for a national housing policy, a book project with former HUD Secretary Jack Kemp, who's I'm sure familiar to many of you. Cisneros holds a Bachelor of Arts and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Texas A&M University. There we go. In the Corps of Cadets, he was a Ross volunteer, and he led the Fightin' Texas Aggie Band. Absolutely. He served as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army, and he earned a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University. I noticed no whoops. And a doctorate in public administration from the George Washington University. Cisneros serves as a member of the Bush School Advisory Board and has designated Texas A&M has been designated as a Texas A&M Distinguished Alumnus. Cisneros is married to Alice P. Cisneros, who also served on San Antonio City Council. They have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. And without any further words from me, I would now like to invite the Honorable Henry Cisneros to the stage. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Robertson, and please convey to Rob Mosbacher my appreciation for the invitation to be here. It was at an event at the Bush School in Washington that he first broached the subject of coming over to talk about this subject. So please tell him thank you for me. Dean, congratulations, sir, on 37 years of public service and this opportunity to serve as Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Let's hear it for the Dean. He stepped into the breach on short notice. He was telling us today that he, at 4:45, on the day that he was supposed to retire at 5 p.m., things transpired on campus that included Dean Welsh leaving to become president, and he was called aside and asked, is there any possibility you might change your mind on retirement and stay on? And he did. And it's to our benefit that he did. We have a person. Thank you to Texas A&M, to the Bush School, to the Mosbacher Institute, the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, to ConocoPhillips, and it's a special treat to have so many heads of major A&M institutions. Porter, thank you for being here. Bruce, thank you for being here. And thanks all of you for coming out on a weeknight to hear a lecture on infrastructure. I am proud to be associated with the Bush School. My classmate, Neil Adams, who is here, called me one day out of the blue and asked me whether I'd serve on the advisory board, and I'm very happy that Neil asked me and that I did, because it's an honor to be associated with anything related to President Bush. I'll just tell you 2 quick stories related to my relationship with him. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was speaking to a group at a hotel in San Antonio, and I got a call. This is before cell phones. You had to go to a payphone to be connected. And I went to the phone, and on the other end of the line was Vice President Bush. This is about 1986 or so. And he said, Henry, President Reagan has just asked me to organize a briefing for President Gorbachev on Thursday. This was a Tuesday. Can you be here on Tuesday? I need you to help brief on American intergovernmental relationships. And this is a time when Gorbachev was trying to think through the restructuring of the Soviet system. And so I was able to get there and went with President Bush to a meeting. There was only about 6 Americans there for the briefing with Gorbachev and his team at the Russian Chancery, and we spent literally about 4 hours, and it was a work session. It was a meeting actually talking about how our system works and, you know, sort of putting ideas in his head. And I watched the Vice President in action that day and knew that he had a future in international affairs. Later, time passed, he became President of the United States, as we know. And then later, President Clinton became president. And there was an event at the White House. I was asked to be in the cabinet. There was an event at the White House that involved the Palestinians and the Israelis and the signing of a peace treaty. And President Bush was invited because he'd been involved in the lead up to these negotiations. So I was standing in a clutch that included the cabinet members, and I think Vice President Gore was in the group. And all of a sudden, a man walks up to the group, grabs me by the shoulder, and says, "Henry, what's a nice guy like you doing with a bunch like this?" But that was classic George Bush, teasing, good-natured, and everybody, of course, laughed at the moment. But what an amazing human being. And actually, I forgot to tell you, Barbara Bush was in the meeting with Gorbachev, and she played a substantial role talking about American life. So these are just amazing people. I would have never imagined that there would be the connection that there is between the Bush family and my beloved alma mater, Texas A&M, but it is a great thing. And I'm so happy to be associated with it today. I would like to introduce my wife, Mary Alice, who is here, as she was introduced as a city councilwoman in San Antonio. She's done her stint in public service, and she goes back a long way because we were dating since high school, and of course then through my A&M years. So she stood in the stadium waiting for a touchdown all of these years. Well, I welcome the opportunity to talk about a critical subject that confronts our nation, and that is infrastructure. Infrastructure is usually thought of as a gray, dull, boring subject, a panorama of hulking steel and endless concrete and electrical wiring and pipes. But it's generally thought of as the purview of engineers and technicians and constructors. But in fact, infrastructure is at the heart of some of the most important dynamics of our national progress. It is an essential part of the workings of our society. What is infrastructure? Well, it's mobility, it's communications, it's cargo and logistics, it's the electric power grid, it's water for human and industrial use, it's facilities for basic services. It is essential to public safety, the facilities for public safety, and health and educational facilities. This lecture is titled, A Discussion of Infrastructure with Respect to the National Economy and with Respect to National Security. So let me say a word about its relationship to both. Infrastructure is the national economy because it generates the growth, it spurs productivity, and enhances our national competitiveness. It's the undergirding of our economic system. It creates jobs and incorporates technology that enhances productivity. It's an interesting thing about infrastructure right at this moment. We're at a point of inflection where the accumulation of new technologies is assuring that the next generation of infrastructure is not going to be the same as the last. It's not just more fossil fuel plants, but it's renewables. It's not just more and wider lanes of roads, but roads that have embedded technology that not only guides people with respect to traffic, but they expect will have the ability to charge electric vehicles as they go down the road, for example. And almost every category of infrastructure you can think of will include some new technology. So the reason for modernization and the importance of it is not just that we need more for reasons of volume or capacity, but that we want to embed new technology in what's going forward. Infrastructure also boosts national pride and confidence. The quality of infrastructure either promotes a sense of visible decline, as we see in some of our cities. You look at hulking masses of deficient bridges, for example, and you wonder, what country is this? Or a visible progress in our essential systems. So it's a matter of kind of giving a sense of the progress of the country. The other aspect of infrastructure, of course, is that it's a contributor to national security. In what respect? Well, trade, for example, through shipping, economic competitiveness. even things as simple as the speed of broadband and the adequacy of broadband, for example. Tangible diplomacy. Countries use infrastructure in international diplomacy. It is strategic assets, and examples of the way it's being used in the international scene. Historically, for example, we invested in the Panama Canal and created a whole new dynamic American economy because of the ability to move goods through the Panama Canal. Today and in recent years, energy independence is an example of infrastructure in a national security context. And the Chinese get it. They're investing massive amounts through a strategy they call Belt and Road to invest in Africa, in Latin America, and other places around the world. It's not always a positive relationship. They're building ports, for example, in places where the ports in the end don't work, but the Chinese reclaim them as naval bases. So there's a clear connection between the way they're thinking about infrastructure. Belt and Road, by the way, is the name they gave their strategy because they defined it as a connection between China and the Far East and Europe and the landmass in between, which was the old Silk Road. And they're attempting a modern version of the Silk Road. It's a very serious strategy. We're confronting it all around the world because of the scale of what they're doing. Let me just say a few quick words about my relationship to infrastructure. It started, I'll be honest with you, here at A&M, just being around people working and institutions working in engineering and the can-do spirit of building the country. Of course, A&M is a land grant institution. And you'll remember from your campusology, the Morrill Act of 1862, during the Civil War, when an act of Congress was passed to build the nation and build the colleges that would train the people who would build the water systems and the roads and do the agricultural development, and A&M is one of those. Infrastructure today is but a modern iteration of the land grant mandate. I was a White House Fellow in the 1970s, and the White House Fellows sent me on a trip to Africa. I went to Tanzania, and there saw in a developing country the way water and electrical generation and roads and ports fit together in a way that I had never understood or never thought about as sort of nation building. That was very influential on my thinking when I got to be mayor of San Antonio in the 1980s, and we ended up being partners in the development of a nuclear power plant to have adequate spinning reserve of power, doubling the size of the convention center, adding an airport terminal, building a 65,000-seat dome stadium, double-decking the freeway downtown, and very importantly, putting a magical tunnel under the San Antonio River so that floodwaters could be diverted and the San Antonio River could remain a stable and attractive touristic attraction. Then when I got to be Secretary of HUD, even though the first letter of HUD is housing, the urban development part involves traveling to 200 different U.S. cities and working on their kind of economic issues, and that frequently involved infrastructure. So I came to an appreciation for what this means, and I would like to share with you my belief this evening that not only is it important in an economic sense and a national security sense, but that A&M is exactly the right place and positioned properly to be a force in infrastructure development in this golden moment when the country is making a major commitment to its infrastructure future. So let me just take a second and describe to you some instances in American history when infrastructure was important. For example, you don't think of it, the Louisiana Purchase this way, but what it did was use the Mississippi River, which was now in American territory, to move goods from the farmlands of the opening northwestern territory, as it was called, down to the port of New Orleans so they could be exported into international markets. It was an infrastructure commitment. Even more descriptive is what happened when Lake Erie and the port at Buffalo was opened because of the Erie Canal all the way across New York State, intersected with the Hudson River and moved goods from the Midwest out to the port of New York. and to Atlantic destinations. That is generally regarded to be one of America's most brilliant infrastructure commitments. The Transcontinental Railroad, you've seen the pictures of the Golden Spike at Promontory Point in Utah, but that connected the nation. That was a massive infrastructure commitment. In the Depression, it was an instrument for pulling us out of 30% unemployment. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which by the way was headed by a Texan, Jesse Jones of Houston, who also came up with the idea for the ship channel, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, all including rural electrification in Texas. If you read some of the histories of Texas modernization, it always talks about the importance of rural electrification, which came out of the Depression. And a young lieutenant named Eisenhower was sent to head a convoy across the United States from the East Coast to the West Coast in the 1920s. His name was Dwight Eisenhower, and he concluded then that if you ever had the power to improve the quality of roads across the United States, he would. When he became president, this is one of his great accomplishments. The most road miles built in the history of the world, creating the interstate highway system for defense. It was set up as a defense initiative. In case we were ever invaded, we'd be able to move troops across the United States. But look at what the implications of that have been. Let me say just a word about what I'd like to do at this point, and that is share with you the work of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Now, you'll have to bear with me. Think of this as a lecture, a real lecture, like a university lecture, and not a political speech. As I described to you, a litany of things. It's 18 categories of infrastructure that are given a grade by the American Society of Civil Engineers. I'm telling you in advance, it's a scary story because of the condition of a good part of our infrastructure. They give the country a grade of C- overall for our infrastructure. That's up from a D just 2 years ago. But let's quickly walk through the elements of what they describe. Roads and highways get a grade of D. 40% of the system is in poor or mediocre condition, and there are 36,000 deaths, the largest percentage of which is associated with road designs that are obsolete for modern traffic, either 18-wheeler trucks or rapidly moving cars. We don't appreciate this as much in Texas because we probably have the best roads in America in Texas. A&M is a major part in that, but roads are a problem across the country. Our bridges, 42% of them are at least 50 years old, 7.5 are structurally deficient, and we have over 100 million trips daily across structurally deficient roads. You followed the news from Minneapolis, from Pennsylvania, and other parts of the United States where bridges have made news. Rail gets the best grade, it gets a B. That is not a federal program, that's private rail, basically freight. It's supported by shipper fees, but there is a repair backlog of $45 billion. An interesting thing about this is what's lacking, and that is high-speed rail and passenger rail. Japan has 1,600 miles of high-speed rail. China has 6,000 miles of rail that runs at 150 to 200 miles an hour. We have 0 miles of high-speed rail. The fastest we can get is roughly 90 miles an hour between Washington and New York on the Acela. Brightline just opened a line in Florida that can get up to 125 in short spans, but experts say the best hope for a true high-speed rail in the United States is the Houston to Dallas, Texas Central line that is proposed, and it will have one stop. Guess where that is? College Station. I mean, it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing, and it deserves our support because it pulls us up from the dregs of high-speed rail in the country, in the world. Transit. 19% of mass transit vehicles are rated as in poor condition. This is a major area. Some Texas cities are making major commitments to rail, transit, light rail. Austin, for example, is putting in some very substantial light rail. The people voted a tax on themselves to do it. Houston has a light rail system. Dallas has a good light rail system. Dallas and Fort Worth are talking about high-speed rail between them. So this is an area of infrastructure that's coming, and there's some new technologies that are cheaper than rail, don't have to put embedded rail, but just dedicated roadway with what they call ART, Advanced Rapid Transit, or Bus Rapid Transit. But it's an idea that's coming with electric buses and so forth. Aviation gets a D+ for terminal and gate congestion, ramp congestion, delays, and a difficult time in recovering from the pandemic. An area that's very interesting here is cargo, air cargo. During the pandemic, people discovered Amazon shipping by air and moved away from bricks and mortar malls and stores, but the result was massive traffic for cargo. And there's hardly a major airport in America that's not rethinking and building massive air cargo facilities. Los Angeles just had a major RFP for rethinking its entire cargo system at Los Angeles. Atlanta, Philadelphia, Newark, all kinds of places working on air cargo. Drinking water, we have a water main break somewhere in the country every 2 minutes. About 6 billion gallons of treated water lost every day in systems that are 100 years old. We've got systems in the United States still where the pipes are wooden pipes. And we've seen the closures in places like Flint, Newark, Jackson, Mississippi this last year, all associated with the inadequacy of our water systems. Wastewater, many treatment plants and collection networks are approaching the end of their lifespan. It's about an $81 billion tab on wastewater. It's a lot cleaner than it was, but still problematic. Ports, one of the major issues in ports is that we can move bigger ships now through the Panama Canal. They come through the canal, but have to get into the ports that were built for smaller vehicles, smaller ships. In Miami, in Norfolk, in New York, not to mention some of the effects of ocean sea level rise in major cities that are getting more severe storms, and our ports are in jeopardy. The inland waterways are important. One barge can carry as much as 70 tractor-trailer trucks, so it takes heavy freight off of the roadways, but a lot of unscheduled dock closures, and places like the Mississippi are constantly in jeopardy with more severe storms that affect the ports at the inland ports. Water management, high hazard dams, 2,300 deficient dams. Levees, 16 million people live or work behind a levee, and 15% of them are rated as high risk. And stormwater, increasing urbanization means impervious surface cover, more stormwater flooding through stormwater systems and impacting things like river streams, lakes, and reservoirs. Energy, obviously a huge area of infrastructure investment. The transformation from the heavy dependence exclusively on fossil fuels to increasing wind and solar. Austin and San Antonio are two of the largest municipalities in the country that have dependence on heavy dependence on solar and wind. We'll see a good deal more of that going forward. There are issues with transmission, but some of the biggest areas of infrastructure investment, and I would say A&M will probably be in the middle of it, are things like improving transmission, storage, batteries, so you can take solar and hold it in storage, distributed power, which is power in communities on a smaller scale, changing the grid so people who have solar can sell it back into the grid, for example. Unbelievable innovations that are occurring, and some of the biggest are yet to come, for example, in use of hydrogen, various forms of hydrogen for fuel. Waste management, solid waste is increasingly a resource to be used, but our systems for using it are not where they ought to be yet. And hazardous waste, we still have 1,300 Superfund sites from heavy industrial hazardous wastes. School buildings in Texas, the largest public financing amounts of money go to improving school systems. Something like 65% of bond issues in Texas are for schools that are becoming overcrowded as our population grows, school-age population grows, and schools are using portable buildings and such. And by the way, I was just in Prince George's County, Maryland last week and saw the creative financing that resulted in building 8 middle schools at one time. They had just been postponing, and they did it to do it. They didn't have the proper funding. They did a creative public-private partnership that used public finance and private capital to build 8 schools, and you'd think you were looking at, just really attractive places for children with all the safety issues thought out of the abuse that occurs in schools, designed out by the way the structures are designed. So there's a lot of work going forward. And then public parks, we have deteriorated trails and parking areas and drinking water systems, deferred maintenance, backlog in a lot of our parks. Finally, I said there were 18, this is the last, high-speed internet access. 65% of counties have access only to lower speed broadband below the definition of what is called broadband, and many disadvantaged and rural communities have less access just because of the terrain or the distances involved and small populations. So that's why there's strategies of subsidization to be able to do that. So let's talk about some of the solutions and some of what's happening in the country at the moment. Federal legislation was passed now about 18 months ago that included the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. As you can see there, $550 billion in the Infrastructure Act. It was bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans. Been years in the planning, difficult to pass. 375 programs, 125 new programs. So some of it is slow in getting out because they have to write the regulations. It takes a good year or so to do that. But it resulted, when you talk about continuing appropriations under existing authorities and this new $550 billion, $1.2 trillion toward what the American Society of Civil Engineering says is the gap of about $2.5 to $3 trillion of infrastructure that we need. This was a major step forward. And it'll amount to more because a lot of it generates local matches and a lot of it will add private investment in the mix. So when I say this is the golden moment for infrastructure, it really is unlike anything we've seen in a generation or more in terms of the scale of what is available. The Inflation Reduction Act was another act that was mostly about clean energy, about $386 billion there. Let me give you an example. It has funding for 500,000 EV charging stations. The experts say if we go to largely electric vehicles by 2035, as the automobile companies are projecting to do, we'll need 2 million charging stations. So the act pays for 500,000. The need is 1.2 billion. A lot of private investment will have to come into the mix. But you can see the nature of the job that's ahead of us, building that much EV charging. And then the CHIPS Act, which was the act that is basically about building our U.S. domestic semiconductor capacity, which is a huge need. We're still depending on Chinese-made semiconductors, and of course, Taiwan is the principal place where semiconductors are built in the world, and we know the national security implications of depending on Taiwan. This just gives you a quick look at what that 1.2 trillion will cover. The areas are pretty much the things that we've talked about here today, and that's an allocation that over the next 5 years is going to be playing out. Now, as I said, the purpose of this lecture was to talk about infrastructure in two ways. It's important to the economy, and its importance to national security. With respect to the economy, it's about growing the economy. You can't envision a growth economy for the United States at the scale we need without modernizing our infrastructure. That's just an integral reality. Jobs, and high-paying jobs that can't be exported. Unlike industries that can go offshore, building our roads, building our dams, fixing our inland ports, that's domestic work. Technological advances, I've described that already, the kinds of technology advances that are built into energy, transportation, communications, and then of course ESG concerns, environmental issues, social and governance. I also mentioned the national security dimensions of economic competitiveness, the base for U.S. manufacturing. One of the effects of the pandemic and of the tension with China has been a new phenomenon people are calling nearshoring or onshoring, as opposed to outsourcing or sending to manufacturing to other parts of the world. It's an amazing thing. Right now, who would have thought that my hometown, San Antonio, would ever be an automotive manufacturing center? But we have a Toyota plant there that builds 240,000 Tundras and Sequoias every year. Largest automotive footprint of a plant in the world. And that attracted Navistar, the former International Harvester, that now builds trucks in San Antonio. And Austin just landed Tesla. You've seen, some of you have, I think, that big manufacturing facility that is like a half mile long along SH 130. And that has spurred literally dozens of automotive suppliers. The Toyota plant alone has 21 suppliers. Now, a lot of them depend on international manufacturing. It's moving into places like Baja California, León, Guanajuato, Monterrey, Mexico, Saltillo, in northern Mexico. So suddenly, from Austin southward is an automotive manufacturing region. That's what it means to have adequate infrastructure. That's why there's 18-wheelers on IH-35 driving from Laredo up to Canada, bringing automotive parts in. Energy independence is an important dimension of how we function in the world. President Bush spoke often about energy independence. It is a mix of things. It is new renewables. It's also taking advantage of the strength we have in fracking and petroleum production and balancing off the reality of being energy independent. I mentioned the Belt and Road strategy from China and the technological issues. Now, let's talk about A&M. As a land grant, A&M's obligation mandate has always been to build Texas and truly build the country. John Sharp asked me a couple of years ago to write the foreword for a book that he wanted to have written about the modern history of A&M. I did write that foreword, and in the process of researching it, it was very clear that what has driven this university to its pinnacle of today, and I use those words advisedly, 66,000 students, and actually I haven't gotten the latest number, so I don't know what we are this September, but it is the largest university in the country in terms of students on a single campus. There are numbers that are larger for places like Central Florida, but most of that is online. This is students on a campus. And the future is unlimited. It is, in my opinion, right at the top of all of the land grants in the United States. And again, that future is unlimited in terms of importance. And I use these words again advisedly. This is important to the state. It's important to the country. We're building the future of the country. A&M has always had that role and played it through what you see there, the Texas Engineering Extension capabilities, the Texas Transportation Institute, our AgriLife Extension. But if you break it down in this moment of golden age of infrastructure, the A&M role is modernization of the existing infrastructure, some of which is obsolete, generation of new technologies into infrastructure, and research and designs for the future. Obviously, our principal role is academic excellence, quality degrees, and creating the workforce that's going to carry this out going forward in the immense array of academic competencies that are A&M's strength. And then we have these extension responsibilities as well. So the A&M role here is critical. And it's critical in part because we are in Texas. Texas is the fastest growing state in the country. Texas is now the second largest state in absolute population, but the fastest growing. And a good part of that is our urban areas that are going to require additional infrastructure. This is Texas and the Texas Triangle. The Texas Triangle is Dallas-Fort Worth in the north, Houston in the southeast, Austin, San Antonio in the southwest. Now, if you look around the metros on that map, you'll see a total of 35 counties. 35 counties define the metropolitan areas of the Texas Triangle. That's 35 counties out of 254 counties. But those 35 counties account for 20 million of the 30 million people in Texas, or 66% of the population lives in 35 counties. We're no longer the land of wide open spaces and ranches and oil. We are an urban complex, maybe the most significantly growing urban complex in the United States. Those 35 counties and their 66%, those 35 counties and their 66% of population produce 77% of Texas GDP. Our GDP is generated by things like the Port of Houston and the new petroleum commitments and energy commitments. Houston is making an unbelievable transformation to these new fuels, research and development. It is literally the energy capital of the world, but not just because of petroleum, because of the new energy commitments. Dallas-Fort Worth with the airport and the commitment to technology. And Austin, of course, with its technology-based, the research capacities there. San Antonio is part of that complex. This is a massively growing part of Texas, and it is going to require new infrastructure. I might just say A&M is not only in the middle of that triangle, but it's actually, Houston is growing so fast that A&M very soon is going to be nearly part of the Houston metro. If we build that rapid rail, A&M will be about 30 minutes from Houston or less, and literally integrated into the Houston metroplex. This is just a quick model of how metropolitan areas define the country. We are a metropolitan nation. That is to say, our economy today is professional services, international trade, new media, hospitality, higher education, the biosciences, technology, and it's happening in these places. The Texas Triangle is an important part of that national story, and I would say that makes this region a globally important region, a pinnacle on the map of world metropolitan areas. Never before in American history has one state had 4 cities that were ranked in the top 10 most populous. That happened just about 3 months ago when Austin was officially documented as the 10th largest city in the country. So you have Houston as the 4th largest city in America with an economy the size of Belgium. Dallas and Fort Worth, Dallas is 9th, Houston is 13th. So Austin became 10th, but Fort Worth is just outside at 13th, and they have an economy the size of Sweden. And Austin, San Antonio, 7th and 10th, an economy the size of Egypt. So if there's any doubt about the significance of what is happening and where it's going, growth breeds growth, economic attraction breeds investment, that draws population and workers. We're gonna need a lot of infrastructure in the Texas Triangle. In 2050, which is only 27 years from now, do the math, it's the same distance that we've come since 1996. If you remember how things were in 96, well, extend that forward to 2050, when Texas grows to 47 million people from the existing 30, and the Triangle goes to 35 million people from the existing 20, and becomes 75% of the population of Texas. These are not figments of the imagination. These are elements of what's happening. Let me wind down here by just describing the kind of infrastructure challenges before our state. Obviously, congested roads and mass transit, such as the high-speed rail that I described a moment ago. By the way, a gentleman named Drayton McLean, who owned the Astros and has been a stellar business figure, is the man behind the Texas Central high-speed rail. He told me he would likely be here this evening, but he promised his wife a vacation, and that was more important than being here for a lecture on infrastructure. In any event, he's a real friend of A&M. As a matter of fact, he is a contributor to our program here at the Bush School in local government, right? He's the money behind that. The power grid, we all know how ERCOT comes to the edge on the hottest day of the summer and the coldest day in the winter, and that needs work. Water, the drought line moves consistently east. It's now roughly along I-35, moving slightly east, which means more of Texas is subjected to drought, and some of these places are places that are fast growing. Austin relies on the Highland Lakes for its water supply. In 1955, during the last really major drought, the Highland Lakes went down to a sufficient level that Austin today would not be able to fully supply its water. They need additional water supplies. San Antonio was in the same position, except we draw our water from an underground aquifer. Largest city in America to draw its water from an underground aquifer, and if the aquifer dropped, we'd be in trouble. So we extended water from Burleson County, 150 miles to San Antonio, and added about 50% more water capacity. Those kinds of things, plus conservation, plus desalination, will have to be part of Texas water future. Global trade, the Port of Houston, obviously a jewel for the entire state. When the port closed a couple of years ago because of the hurricane, there were lines for gasoline all over Texas because trucks couldn't get out of the Port of Houston. And gateway airports like Dallas and Houston. Austin now has direct routes to London, Amsterdam, Paris, Frankfurt, and San Antonio just 2 weeks ago announced its first international flights to Europe, to Germany. We have massive housing and urban space needs. In 1 year, Austin's housing rents increased by 40% from 2020 to 2021. 40% increase in rents. Basically a supply and demand imbalance. Don't have enough production of affordable housing. And the Great Springs is a beautiful project. I have it up there because it's indicative of what we'll need to be doing on open space. It's a 75-mile linkage of creekways and springs linking Austin and San Antonio for 75 miles. If we tie it down today and keep that open space, then we'll have it in place as the region becomes a metroplex of itself. And finally, in education, we've talked about pre-K, K through 12, and higher education. Well, let me close my remarks tonight by saying, you may think of the Bush School as a school of public policy, a school of public service. But because it is at A&M, it is tied to engineering and architecture and economics and business school and many, many other capacities on this campus. Infrastructure is right at the heart of our public policy concerns. A&M can play a major role, and the Bush School can be a major role. Just in common man's language, these are realities. These things are going to happen, these rates of growth, these challenges. It's undeniable that we will need additional infrastructure investment and technological investment in them for our people to live with a good quality of life. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how we prepare. We will need leadership in that preparation. A&M has always been in a leadership position and has always trained people for leadership positions. That responsibility will become just as acute as it has ever been through this process, and the Bush School will be at the head of the line. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make a visit.
Secretary, I want to thank you so much for that amazing lecture. I have to say, I've been in school my whole life and seen a lot of lectures, and that was one of the best ones I've ever seen. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great.
I think I broke the rules. It was supposed to be 25 minutes, and we're a little over that.
You know, we're all friends here. Hopefully people will hang out just like 10 more minutes. We opened up the opportunity for questions online, and I have a bunch of questions, but I'd like to start with the ones that we got online because I want the audience to try and get a response. There was about 10 questions, so we can't answer or ask all of them. Sorry about that. The first one, though, was that people want to know what instrument you played in the Aggie band. Can you elaborate on
I
that?
played the instrument that I played in high school, which was a French horn, but not very well. And I only played it for a couple of years because I became the sergeant major of the combined band, and then the combined band commander, where you walk with a flag and a trumpet that doesn't make a sound. So I see one of my classmates, Alan Backoff, is over here, who, like many of you, moved from other places in Texas to come back and be at the home ground in College Station. But those were great years. I enjoyed being in the Aggie band. It's a thrill. I do not move at halftime. Stand and watch the band perform even now.
That's awesome. We really appreciate you coming back for the games. One of the other themes that was in a number of those questions that came in online was, number one, is that obviously George H.W. Bush believed that public service was a noble calling, and you exemplify that through your entire career. We wanted to thank you for that. But this is the ConocoPhillips Inside the White House lecture series, and we didn't hear a lot about inside the White House. So can you tell us a little bit about your HUD experience and some of the challenges that you faced while you were secretary, and what you think some of the lasting issues have been? I mean, if you want to talk about homelessness, that was one of your key issues, or some of the other experiences.
You know, it was a wonderful opportunity to serve as Secretary of HUD. When I was mayor, I didn't have much to do with HUD because I didn't think it was very capable or productive or helpful. I just didn't. But in 1992, you'll remember after the Rodney King incident, there were those riots in Los Angeles. And Mayor Bradley had been a friend of mine in Los Angeles because I was president of the National League of Cities, and I got to know him well. He's a wonderful human being. He was crushed because all his dreams for Los Angeles were going out the window that night. I called him the next morning and I said, is there anything I could do to help? He said, yeah, could you come out? Because I'm afraid the rioting that's happening in African American neighborhoods is going to spread to the Latino neighborhoods. And we're going to have literally riots as people try to protect their homes in those neighborhoods. And we just need people to come out and try to calm things down. So I went out and joined some people who are high profile in Los Angeles, got on television and such, tell people, keep your children home, let's try to cool things off. The riots went on for several nights, you will recall. In any event, on the basis of that, when President Clinton asked me, I want you to be in the cabinet, what job do you want? I thought of several, but it's one of those moments where you just have a kind of a epiphany. I was literally shaving, and I thought to myself, if I'm gonna break up the business that I'm trying to create to go be in the government, it ought to be for something that I know, that makes sense, that I can turn around, that I can make a difference. And with that fresh experience from April, this is now November, with that fresh experience from April of what I saw and was fearful about where our country's going, literally out on the streets of a major American city, Los Angeles, with rioters running down the street in trucks, breaking into buildings and into retail stores and taking goods out. The sky is orange from the flames. I just thought I need to try to do something about this arena, which is the nation's cities and urban areas. So I said, I'll do HUD. And he said, are you sure? I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. As a result of that service, first of all, it's a great opportunity to serve our country, and President Bush did it for an entire life in multiple positions. He was ambassador to China, he was head of the CIA, he was UN ambassador. Secretary of HUD gives you a chance to really learn the country at the grassroots level. I went to 200 different cities in every one of the 50 states, Indian reservations, Montana, Idaho, Alaskan communities, the Mississippi Delta. You really learn the country. And so we'll be forever grateful for understanding our country as a result of that sort of personal view of it. I concluded there were 3 areas where I could maybe make a difference. On the day of my nomination to be HUD secretary, a fellow came and poked me on the shoulder, and he said, I don't even know who he was, but he said, Mr. Secretary, just remember that the H in HUD stands for housing, and the first job of the housing secretary ought to be to address people who are completely unhoused, the homeless. So I put a lot of time and effort into homeless initiatives, and I think we made a difference. Unfortunately, we have had some major setbacks in the country. The economic recession that blunted the production of housing, and now housing is just not enough housing is being produced. A lot of home builders went out of business, and we just don't have enough housing being produced, which is the Austin problem, but a lot of other places. So homelessness is a major commitment. Then I remember the day that one of the assistant secretaries responsible for FHA came in and said, we've just run the numbers. And with the balancing of the budget that the Clinton administration was undertaking, and in fact did, interest rates are going to come down, and we're going to have a substantial housing boom before the decade is out. The highest home ownership rate ever achieved in America was 66%. At that time, it was 62%. And there's a chance with this boom in housing, we can exceed the nation's previous home ownership high. We should try. So we pulled together 47 different private sector groups like the Mortgage Bankers and the American Bankers Association and others, and said, tell us what you can do in your sphere that we can ride the crest of lower interest rates and generate home ownership levels. Home ownership rate was 62%. The white home ownership rate was 74%. The African American home ownership rate was 42%. And the Latino home ownership rate was 42%. So a pretty good gulf, like 30% difference in home ownership rate in the country when home ownership is so important to people. I looked at one study that said 3 things created the middle class after World War II. One of them was the GI Bill, and that was certainly true. A lot of people got to college, including to A&M, on the GI Bill. Another one was the protection of wages, minimum wage, and the third one was home ownership, because it creates net worth. For most people, the sum total of their net worth is the equity they have in their home. That's what gives you the ability to borrow so you can send children to college or borrow to start a small business. So when there's a 30% home ownership gap between sectors of our society, we're not giving people the machinery that they need to move to the middle class. So in the end, we did get the home ownership rate over 66%, and the minority home ownership rate went right to 50, right to 50. So a big difference in a lot of people's lives. That was the second. And then the third was a lot of focus on the horrible conditions in public housing in many of the nation's cities. We redid 254 major public housing developments. And when I say developments, I mean places with like 12 buildings that you wouldn't want to go into. In fact, I went to Baltimore with the mayor of Baltimore and asked, I was there for a different reason, but I'd heard about this public housing called Lexington Homes. I said, do you mind if we go over to Lexington Homes? I want to see with my own eyes. We got there and the police wouldn't let us in the building. They said, we cannot let you in, it's not safe. Drug lords run the building, right? So we got 254 of those developments, either completely torn down and replaced, did some in Dallas, West Dallas, did some in Houston, I think it's Allen Parkway Village, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a long answer to what was substantial about that period, for me.
Well, one of the things we really appreciate is you coming back and talking to the community, and we want to promote this ethic of public service as well. You got started in city council, right? I mean, is that something you'd still recommend people doing, or how would you recommend to our students to really launch their careers in public service?
I didn't ever expect to be in politics. I went to graduate school, and I thought I probably wanted to do something in the urban arena, but I really thought I'd be a city manager or some sort of city administrator, because I did like the idea of trying to, build our cities, and some of my heroes were people who were doing that. I was a great fan of the then mayor of New York, John Lindsay, and that has an A&M connection, because Wayne Stark, some of you may recognize that name, he was head of the MSC. He had people he selected who he thought could do something if they could shake themselves into confidence, and he asked me to go. Neil, you remember Fiducia, Carl Fiducia. Carl Fiducia and I were sent to West Point as SCONA representatives at the Student Conference on United States Affairs at West Point, where we were completely outclassed. But in any event, Wayne Stark said, I'll send you, but I'm going to ask something of you. You got to give me a week, and I'm going to send you to New York en route to West Point, and I'm going to put you together with people that I want you to meet in media, in government, Aggies, in media, in government, and in the news, in the private sector, Wall Street, and it was a complete eye-opener for a guy who had never been on an airplane, never been to the East Coast, and suddenly found himself walking on the streets of New York. And that trip helped. We were juniors. That trip helped reshape my thinking about what I wanted to do. But when I got back to San Antonio, there wasn't an opening for that. I did get an offer from the University of Texas at San Antonio to be on the faculty there and teach. And my students were the ones who said, you need to run for city council. We don't have anybody your age or your background on the city council. We'll be your campaign. I hadn't thought I was going in that direction, but I did. Arrived back in San Antonio in August of '74, announced for city council in December of '74, and got elected in April of '75, and served 6 years on the city council and 8 years more as mayor. But it wasn't planned. It was just something that happened.
Well, that's great.
But yes, I would suggest to young people who want to be in public life that they ought to start by getting experience. And what I learned most, and I'll be very brief, what I learned most about being on the city council was the connection to the people and a connection to the issues. And I learned some really important lessons. San Antonio is a nonpartisan form of government. So it wasn't a matter of Democrats or Republicans or liberals or conservatives. It was, how do you make things happen? How do you bring people together? How do you make some progress? That was an important lesson. No permanent allies, no permanent enemies, just the issues, just the causes, just the mission. So it is a good place to start.
Great. I'll just end with this because I realize we're running out of time. But one of the questions that did come in was your opinion of the infrastructure bill. I mean, you presented a lot of problems, and then you presented this as a potential solution. Are we done, or what still needs to be done, and how far did the infrastructure bill get us?
Well, no, I do not believe we're done. I indicated some number, the gap between what the civil engineers say is the size of the gap, up to $3 trillion, and what this bill and others like it do, which is about half of that amount. So some of it will be through traditional public finance, which is bonds, but there are limits on what municipal debt can do and what debt limits are. So the private sector will have to step in. We have a lot of money tied up in the United States in pension systems, retirement systems, insurance companies, for example, and they're all interested in deploying that money and investing it in useful things. So a pretty substantial industry has been created. Most pension systems, they invest in equities, stocks, fixed income, bonds, and what they call alternatives, which is real estate, commodities, and one of those increasingly to the tune of about maybe 7% of total pension systems is infrastructure. And that's a good thing because they can get some pretty substantial returns. They can get returns of 8, 10, 12% on infrastructure. It's not the 20% that you get on hedge funds and private equity, but those are very risky. But it's a lot better than what you get on bonds, and just about as safe because the infrastructure is going to have to be built and going to get built. So I think we're going to have to figure out more ways to tap some of those resources. This is not radical stuff. This is happening as we speak. Big companies like Brookfield and General Infrastructure Partners and a host of others are working with the likes of Bechtel and Jacobs and Walsh and Clark, the big constructors, the energy companies and others, to tap investment capital to build some of the infrastructure. That's what's going to close the gap on EV charging, for example, or some of the other things we've talked about. And there's very creative financing that's being developed, like municipalities that can't afford to do it in a lump sum, but they could pay for it over time if the private sector will undertake to do it in the short run. So I'm involved in some of that, which is why I know a little bit about it, but I think that's part of where we're headed.
Well, you've given us so much to think about. I'd love to spend another hour, obviously, chatting with you about this. I'm sure other people would like to come up and ask you some questions, but we've run out of time, so I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just say, A&M for me has been one of, if not the most important dynamic in my life. Because I came here as a product of the west side of San Antonio, shy, younger than my class, and the Corps of Cadets was the kind of place that was a complete, what they call meritocracy. You succeed on merit. If you can perform on the drill field, if you can perform some level of intramural athletics, if you can get the grades and have some leadership capabilities, the Corps of Cadets will pull it out of you. And for me, it was a life-changing experience. And I owe most of what I've been able to do since to that experience of the Corps and A&M in the 1960s. Even the trip that turned me on to what I'm doing today was an A&M sponsored trip. So I really hope for that experience for other young people across the state. And I've been spending some time with Commandant McMichaels to figure out. I had this little moment when I attended the recent Hall of Honor induction, where I just thought to myself, we're changing as a state. The demographics of Texas is changing. We need to have more people have the experience that A&M was for me in the 1960s and still is today, whether it's the Corps or whether it's the student body generally. But there probably isn't another place of leadership development like Texas A&M. And I saw it today when with those students who spoke to our advisory board. I noticed, like myself, that some of those students started life by having been turned down somewhere else. One of them wanted to go to the Naval Academy, didn't get in. Another one wanted to do something else, didn't get in. But A&M is a place where even if you've been turned down somewhere else, you can be challenged to rise to the same level as anybody else in America. That's Texas A&M.
And I hope you know that A&M, the Bush School, and the Moss Backer Institute will always be home for you. So you're always
Thank
welcome.
you.
So thank you all very much, and thank you again.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having me.
Have a good night.